Hello.
David, how are you?
No, you're Brendan or Brandon?
Brendan, yeah, that's my name. Yeah.
Brandon, okay.
Brendan.
Brendan, okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
I should
I
have
think
guessed.
I'm not sure. Brandon is like some American bastardization, I think, of the original name. I'm not sure. I could be
Yeah,
wrong.
I was about to say Brendan is more Irish.
Yeah. Pretty sure that's the way it goes. Of course, I could be utterly wrong, and I don't even know what I'm talking about. But it sounds like one of those things that maybe was. Yeah. So you can hear me, okay?
Yeah, can you hear
And
me
all that.
okay?
Yeah, no problem. So may as well get right into it. So today I'm going to be talking to David McMurdo, who is going to talk to us about his. I'm going to say this the way I would say it, and you can correct me if I'm not saying it the way you prefer. But his own brand of not his own brand. God, I'm already his own interpretation of mysticism and how he uses it to help people psychologically. Is that correct?
I would say that it's my own expression of mysticism because mysticism is just mysticism. It's just a question of, the way it's being conveyed and what traditions are being referred to in that conveyance, if any. But
Right.
it's about transcending psychology more than it's about delving
Right.
into psychology.
But like as a way to help people, anyways, through in their
That's
personal
right, yeah.
lives. Yeah. So I have to ask you first off, why do you say mysticism and not mysticism?
Why do I?
Is
Sorry,
You say mysticism and not mysticism.
mysticism. Maybe it's just my accent, but
Oh, is
yeah.
it? Sorry. Okay. No, I thought there was like some. I thought it was out of the loop on some other new word that I. Okay. So yeah, maybe summarize that if you can. And you won't be talking to people that need to be convinced out of atheism or anything, so you don't have to worry too much in your explanation, if you get me.
Well, the definition of mysticism that is usually given is the pursuit of conscious unity with God.
Mm-hmm.
But given that mysticism is a phenomenon that arises within every tradition globally and has done historically, and outside of every tradition, I prefer a more broad expression of it because there's no doubt, for example, that there has been Hindu mystics, Buddhist mystics, mystics from all the dharmic traditions. And they would certainly not use a term like God, though it's very clear from the way those mystics speak that they are referring to that which others would call God. So I think the definition of mysticism as a pursuit of the conscious unity with God is a little bit too limited. That's coming more from an Abrahamic perspective. You might
Okay.
say mysticism is the pursuit of conscious unity with that which men call God, thus opening up a little bit.
Okay. So a bit broader in the scope.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but from what I saw of you before, you definitely came at it from a Christian perspective, even though you say you're not Christian.
No,
Am I
I'm not
wrong about?
Christian myself, but it's the tradition that I'm more familiar with. And I just think that when you're speaking to a Western audience as I am, it's just the most useful. Well, it's a bit of a double-edged sword because on the one hand, everyone knows who Yeshua, who Jesus is.
Yeah.
So whoever you're speaking to in a Western audience, they have that immediate familiarity with the terminology you're using. But it's a double-edged sword because when you do that, you're naturally going to clash with those more orthodox Christians who understand the things you're referencing in a radically different way. So I basically
Yeah.
use my discernment to decide how I'm going to speak about this in any given circumstance. I think that on a channel like yours, because I took the time to look at your website and your channel, I think I'd be pretty safe not relying on Christian references.
No. So yeah, I was going to say, if given that option, what reference would you use? You would just use just the more broader, like you began with already, I guess. Nothing specific.
Yeah, I mean, on a personal level, I am more traditionally inclined. So I
Mm-hmm.
like to use words like spirit. But if
Mm-hmm.
I'm speaking like to someone in this town, Scotland is a very secular country, and this is a very secular part of the country. Instead of saying spirit, I would just say consciousness because everyone basically knows what that means. And the word spirit is just the way the ancients referred to consciousness. So yeah, I'll
Right.
adapt based on the audience that I'm speaking to, essentially.
Right. So maybe, yeah, if you don't mind, describe in brief your method that you apply. Then I guess.
Well, I would simply encourage souls to recognize certain ways they confess their own transcendent identity.
Right.
Actually, I saw a good example on Twitter not long before, and I'm sure you've seen this on Twitter a lot during the lockdown. Like, souls will say, "My mental health is really suffering during this lockdown," and the question becomes then, well, who or what are you to so calmly and rationally assess this mental health, this mind that is so apparently chaotic? There is something that is beyond the mind and is capable of looking at the mind and saying, this mind is chaotic, my mental health is suffering. And so, in
Right.
all these kinds of ways, souls confess their transcendent state, but they
Mhm.
don't really recognize the significance of what they're saying. And
Right.
so, I tend to employ the basic components of matter, mind, and spirit, or
Mhm.
consciousness,
Right.
because that's a very global way of understanding these things. So we all understand matter. We live in a material realm. We have a physical body. We all understand mind. We all have a mind. The tricky part is consciousness or spirit. And the fact that we are consciousness is very self-evident. And so when I speak about these things, I'm not asking anyone to accept something utterly abstract. I'm not laying out some, for example, although I have things to say on the subject, I'm not doing as a religionist would, which is to lay out some convoluted theology concerning the nature of Yeshua's atonement, or something that no one can verify, something that they either take or leave.
Right.
This is something that it's what I call experiential spirituality. It's the name of my book, and it's
Okay.
experiential. It's a shame because spirituality, by its very nature, is experiential.
Mhm.
But the word spirituality is used in so many different ways that you really have to make clear that that's what you're talking about. Because in the modern day, spirituality, it could mean anything. It could mean someone expressing a form of mysticism, or it could mean someone who's selling scented candles.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I really like the term experiential spirituality, because this is an awareness that evolves in your day-to-day life. It's not something abstract in your mind.
Mhm. Yeah. If you were like, I got the impression you have counseled many people with this, with your method. What
Absolutely, yes.
how do
But
you what do you run through them once you've gotten explain that?
well,
What's
the
what how
main issue for souls living in mortal form is that they're bound up in their egoic identity,
Right.
which others might call their personhood, which is essentially their idea of who they are, and they don't see themselves as anything else. And you see this
Mm.
very clearly when you ask someone, "Who are you?" They'll give you first of all their name. They might give you their occupation. They might give you their hobbies, but all of this is what's called the egoic identity. It's the idea we have of who we are. And so,
Right.
because I'm not asking anyone to accept anything abstract, I just essentially take them back through their own process of conditioning and point out the
Okay.
obvious fact, for example, that there was a time where they existed without any of that idea of themselves, without any of that ego whatsoever. Uh, so I take them back to childhood, for example. There was a time when they didn't even have their name, but they received their name, and that became the foundation of their egoic identity. As they
Mm.
matured physically, they came to recognize themselves in ever more complicated ways. Male as
Yeah.
opposed to female, straight as opposed to homosexual, and so on and so forth. Until in adulthood, you have this very complicated intellectual structure, which is what we call the egoic identity. But the important
Right.
recognition is that is not foundational, that is not original, that came after and was heaped upon the consciousness that we are. And so, this state that we all existed in prior to this conditioning,
Hmm.
this belief that we are our egoic identity, that
Hmm.
is what the ancients, especially those speaking from the Judaic and Christian traditions, that's what they would call innocence. And the
Right.
pursuit of spirituality, in their terminology, was to return to that innocence,
Right.
which is to recognize that the one you take yourself to be is necessarily not you. And so
Mm.
spirituality is fundamentally a coming out of that conditioning. It's a reversal of that conditioning.
Right.
And so that's what I deal with essentially.
I see. So like you can see that with people, and as you travel through life and as you get older and you see how other people progress, there's definitely people that choose identities for themselves. Many manufacture them out of nothing, I've noticed as well. The really, really fake people, sadly, not to disparage them too much. Generally in that case, they start from a, how can I say, they're big warriors and they doubt themselves greatly or something like that. I think that's where the origin of that. But people that intentionally like slip, like I think of a relative who it seemed when he became a man, past a teenager, he manufactured for himself this identity of this guy who was kind of like a go-getter, going places guy, and he would be like this all the time. And all of a sudden, his personality totally changed, and it was no unrecognizable and annoying. But you could tell that it was just false. And I'm sure, I don't know if he's still, I haven't talked to him for years, if he's still clinging to that. But I knew that in a way, through what you're saying, I recognize that in personal experience myself, in other people more than myself, I guess. Because not to say that I'm some kind of genius, I'm definitely not, but I definitely always held a line to my original innocence. I felt it was important and unreal to change, because I can think of other people too who you encounter a fork in the road and you maybe choose or are forced down a certain direction, and then there's trappings that come with that you choose or maybe even feel forced to take into yourself, which again is unnecessary, untrue, and then you're trapped with this baggage that can just burden you, I guess. So that's all part of it. And the other thing I wanted to say before I forget, sorry, I'm saying all this crap, but is I think it was Alan Watts. You were saying from when you at the beginning there about how your own original innocence is something apart from what your personality is at the end. And he was talking about how if you stop to self-examine and you're thinking about yourself in your own head, I'm pretty sure it was him, you realize there's kind of a conversation going on, and that you are putting yourself and your own virtue and your own decisions under scrutiny. And if you concentrate on that long enough, you come to the conclusion that the person, even the entity, dare I say, I don't really mean to use that word, that is scrutinizing this is not you in some ways.
Oh yes, this understanding goes back to the Hindu Vedas, the Upanishads, the most mystic of Hindu texts, and there's a great metaphor in there of the two birds. One is called the perceiving bird, and the other is the active bird. The active bird is the bird that thinks thoughts and that acts in the world, whereas the perceiving bird is the one that silently observes the bird that is active. As consciousness, we are the perceiving bird always, but we believe ourselves to be the active bird. And that's what I'm not too familiar with Alan Watts, but that sounds very much like what he was speaking about there. And as I like to point out, we've all heard of reincarnation, and most souls understand it as this idea that after the death of our mortal form, some immortal part of ourselves passes on to a new mortal form. And I don't deny that reality at all. But as ever, there's always an exoteric, a surface level, and an esoteric, a hidden understanding to these ideas. And the esoteric understanding of reincarnation is the very cycle of personhood that you were just talking about with your friend, for example.
Yeah.
When consciousness finds itself in mortal form, it tends to fall into this habit of going through cycles of personhood, and they're constantly trying to adapt to the world around them for the sake of survival, because fundamentally they take themselves to be the human vessel, and a human vessel is necessarily vulnerable to the whole world, and therefore they adapt in these ways. They go through these cycles of personhood in order to survive, essentially. And that's what so many things in the occult refer to as well, like the death card and the tarot deck, for example. It's so often used very dramatically in Hollywood films and TV series. A character gets the death card and they go outside and get hit by a bus or something. But in reality, the death card refers to a death of personhood and the reformation of an egoic identity. But all of this is entirely needless, because we are truly, to go back to the Upanishads, the perceiving bird. And when you recognize yourself as the perceiving bird, as it were, you can see all of this play out very clearly in your own psychology and concerning your own mortal form, and you can be detached from it. This is why mystics are very known for their I used to say indifference, but that sounds a bit harsh. Let's just say equanimity. They're not affected by things because they see the world as the consciousness that they actually are, instead of being so invested in the games of egoic identity.
Right. So it's like that animalistic innocence in a way of just like totally natural, like raw experience, or being an observer, but part of it all at the same time, without sort of trying to deny or run away or escape for any of it, but at the same time showing that indifference isn't, I wouldn't think that's so harsh a word, but yeah, it's a useful word for like the extremes of pleasure and pain and all these things that are enticing this way or that. You tend to have a certain indifference.
Right. But there's a famous, there's something that is said or has been said, or certain figures have said it in terms of mystic thought. They'll say that, for example, hate and love and pleasure and pain, they are in the end the same, which from a human perspective sounds utterly insane. But what they're saying is that either one of those things will take you away from the equanimity that I'm talking about, from the place of peace, essentially.
Yeah. And I would think of it platonically, where like reason is the highest order. And when you're contemplating reason, you're doing the work, the true work of, the goal of the universe, let's say.
Yeah, so I was very interested in looking at
an abandonment of emotion to a certain degree. But another thing you said before, I wanted to ask you. So you compared to that innocence of animals, and I heard you say that a couple of times in other before, and like, so there's that. What do you say to the duality of that? Because in the same way that you have total innocence of your dog, or say your, and they are innocent of the world, they aren't aware of their death, and they don't harangue themselves over the future. But in that innocence, there's also the, like, a cat will slowly torture to death, cruelly, a mouse or a frog, you know what I mean? And this kind of, in that way, it kind of, is innocence the correct word for that? Is my question, I guess.
I believe it is, because even babies, they will do things that, if they had the cognitive capacity to consider their actions, they would. If they were older and had a moral framework to refer to, and the cognitive capacity to comprehend such a thing, they would. But they are innocently doing it. That's why, you don't blame a dog when it bites someone. I mean, you might want to cage it or put it down, but you don't blame them, morally speaking, for it, because you know that a dog is a dog and it's doing what it's doing. So I would still...
Yeah. I see what you mean, yeah. No, for sure. But I even, and when Watts, when he was saying that, I'm not sure. He may have been thinking of it, the way you said it there, I'm not too aware of that origin story about the birds. But I thought he was meaning more where the one doing the observance, that's not the word you used, the, what's the word? The part of yourself that's making note of things, observing and commenting on it.
The consciousness?
No, you said there was the part that's experiencing it, and the part that's kind of, I'll use the word observing, it doesn't matter. Not that was your true self, but that was like your daemon, say, platonically speaking, that you were being guided through instinct by sort of another force, in a way. That's what I thought.
I'm not sure what he was referring to then, but that's just how I would interpret what he said. But what he was actually referring to, as I said, I'm not too familiar with Alan Watts, so I don't know.
Oh, right. Well, you know about the Platonic, Neoplatonic idea of the daemon, which is like sort of a guiding spirit that's like a duel with you, and kind of you feel like it's helping you out when you obey your instinct in a way, if you learn to sort of tune into it. What would you say about that?
I'm familiar with that concept, but it's not something I refer to myself. There's a lot in Platonic thought that is obviously relevant to my own understandings, especially concerning Gnosticism, because Gnosticism was just Platonic thought mixed with Christian mythology and Jewish mysticism. And so the idea of the monad from which everything emanates, that kind of thing is highly relevant. But as far as a daemon, there could be a way that you could express mystic truth employing those things. But for me, it would be overcomplicating it. And I'm always very eager to keep things as simple as possible.
So you look at it very practically all the time, and you don't have specific, or maybe you do, and maybe you'd like to share them, specific spiritual notions about the universe or the future. Would you? Are you just
I've got all kinds of crazy stuff. I could say some. I could say some wild things, but the thing is,
well, summarize the craziest ones. How about that? That's what I'm going to hear.
Well, the thing is that I try to distinguish myself from religionists because a religionist will just come with a truckload of dogma, and they'll expect
Yeah.
others to accept it, possibly
Yeah.
with the threat of hellfire accompanying it. So I try
Right.
to distinguish myself from that by keeping things very down to earth and very practical. As far as I'm
Right.
concerned, the more extreme stuff can come later on, and I don't expect anything. I don't expect anyone to just accept what I say just because I said it. In fact, if they do that, they've misunderstood everything that I've said. All they have to do is pay attention to the way life unfolds before them, the way they perceive life, and see the ways that they are truly not what they take themselves to be. But sure, I mean, I could give you all kinds of
Give us a couple of the that are like you think are really, that you feel is true. That sorry, it's a bit windy there. That would sound outrageous, maybe, or whatever you like. Share anything you like about it.
Well, I said before that I like to broadly stick to the categories of matter, mind, and spirit because they are universally employed. But I do also employ a term called aether, which is an ancient term, but I don't mean it in the way that the ancient philosophers meant it. I don't mean it in the way that the medieval alchemists meant it, and I don't mean it in the way that the scientists of the early 20th century made it. When I refer to aether, I'm referring to the substance of that which others would call ghosts or phantoms. It's essentially a necessary category in order to understand certain things. Now, here
Right.
in the Highlands of Scotland, there's a mountain called Ben McDooey. It's the second highest mountain in Scotland and the whole of the United Kingdom. And on this mountain, there's said to be this entity called the Fear Lieth, that depending on witness reports, it either attempts to frighten souls off the mountain or it's the Scottish equivalent of the abominable snowman. But this entity has been calling me to that mountain for years on end now, and I feel a need to venture up Ben McDooey and confront this. So, I've got plenty of things like that I could talk about, but you see, when I say something like that, that's something you can either take or leave. It's not
Yeah.
relevant to your immediate experience of reality, and that's why I tend to keep things grounded. It's just an interesting story.
Yeah. 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 Is that how old is that story of Ben McDooey? Is it pre-Christian or is it?
I'd say it's about 200 years old. It's not as old as something like the Loch Ness monster for sure.
Oh, really? Loch Ness is I didn't know Loch Ness was old. How
Yeah,
far back?
the first sighting of the Loch Ness monster goes back to a saint several centuries ago. So
Oh,
it's certainly far older than the legend of the big grey man of Ben McDooey.
right, right.
Saint
No,
Columba, that was it. Yeah.
yeah, you should go up there with a webcam and make it like a show, like record your experience.
Oh, I'd absolutely record it.
But yeah, so the most problems you probably get, I would guess, I could be wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I've never tried to psychologize anyone or help them in that way. I mean, maybe I have, like, totally anecdotally and as a civilian, let's say. But is a hard believing Christian probably is the one you get the hardest reaction from, I would guess, because as you said, they have that duality, heaven and hell duality. You're either with me or you aren't. And if they hear anything that sounds outside the purveyance of their laws they live by, that they I mean, anybody who's strongly religious that way reacts badly against anything that counters it. And they might, especially with religions like Christianity, because they've been taught that anything that isn't in their strict teachings is also evil and from the devil, and they're trying to seduce them into, like, am I right that that's some of the hardest people to help?
Absolutely. And that's especially true, on those occasions where I use Christian terminology, because there's that phenomenon called the narcissism of small differences, where someone is more likely to get into a strong disagreement with someone who seems to be saying similar things, or who comes from a similar framework as they do, than someone who comes from a radically different framework. But yes, certainly, and those who have expressed mysticism have never been evangelical. They've never ever, it doesn't matter what mystic you're looking at, what tradition they came from, they've never been evangelical, and they've never said that everyone needs to be where they are in the spiritual journey, as it were. And as you just said, most religionists do not have that philosophy. They believe that there is one way to salvation, and that salvation ultimately amounts to believing the correct theology. Christians, for example, especially Protestant Christians, they will give lip service to talking about how it's only Jesus that saves us, it's only faith that saves us. But when you really get down to it, if you disagree with their perspective on the atonement, if you disagree with an understanding of God, for example, if you were to reject the doctrine of the Trinity, then you would soon find out that what they actually believe is that Judgment Day is tantamount to a theology test. And that's just not at all what mysticism has ever conveyed. So certainly I experience a lot of resistance from religionists. I get called a heretic all the time. But, words like heretic, that's just basically the right-wing traditionalist version of a left-winger throwing out terms like racist and homophobic, as far as I'm concerned. They're just buzzwords for souls who aren't capable of engaging in the conversation.
And yeah, I know what you mean. So, like, even it's here. I don't want to ask you if is it worse with Catholics or Protestants. I would guess, obviously, hardcore Protestants would be worse if we're going to be serious here, because they tend to have that real, it's written in the book and that's the end of it. Only like the really hardcore ones. I actually didn't know, as you said, that evangelists are never spiritualists, but I can see what you mean. So they're just totally like, this is the law, this is what it says, you do this, and that's the end of it. So there's no room for. But I mean, wouldn't you call someone? Would you call like Thomas Aquinas? Would he not be? Is he not? I guess he's not an evangelist, or what?
A mystic, you mean?
He's a mystic, but he's also sort of. I thought he would be also an evangelist in a way. Maybe I'm confused on that term.
Yeah, I don't consider Thomas Aquinas a mystic at all, in all honesty.
Okay. How come?
Now, he was a very good theologian, but I wouldn't consider him a mystic because someone like Meister Eckhart, there's a good example of a Catholic mystic, or Saint Teresa of Avila. But Thomas Aquinas, as far as I know, was just a theologian.
Okay. So maybe I may not even know the proper criteria for a mystic. So what is it?
Well, it would be someone who testifies of direct experience of the spiritual, as opposed to someone who just tries to figure things out on an intellectual basis, and based on what the Bible or their particular sacred text has to say to them. The mystic is one who has direct experience of the spiritual and testifies to the world of that experience. And that's why mystics, they're often opposed by no one more strongly than their fellow religionists, because religionists tend to like to focus on theology and on what the Apostle Paul ironically called the dead letter. They prefer to focus on scripture, whereas mystics are all about direct experience. And the problem with that is that very often what mystics come back with, having had that direct experience, it often runs contrary to the dogmas of the day. And that's why it was always very dangerous to be a mystic throughout history, regardless of what tradition you belong to.
Right.
In fact, within Protestant circles, even the word mysticism is a dirty word.
Well, I just think, like, when you think of them, like, I know, so I'm obviously in Ireland, and there's a lot of Irish Catholics, but they're also very pagan. Like, I mean, half of them still believe in the fairies and things, or would, like, pay them a certain lip service anyways, whether they would seriously admit to a belief. But there would be a certain a fear and a reverence for them still, like, really. And these are, pious Catholics as well. So that's kind of, how would you define that? This does not really. It's not an evangelical understanding of their religion. It's more like they're spiritually open, or.
Yeah, when I use the term religionist, the term religionist refers to one who is very zealous about their particular dogma. It doesn't refer to just anyone who adheres to a religion. Most religious souls are nominal, which is to say they don't take their religion very seriously. So, yeah, I can quite imagine that there's many Catholics over in Ireland who have that affinity for, the more traditional elements of that culture.
Right, yeah. You broke up a little bit at the end there, but I think I got the gist of it. But what was I going to ask you now? I forget now. Let me think. I was about to ask you something. I totally lost it. I don't. This isn't live or anything, so I always cut it out if I like screw up like this and can't remember what I'm gonna. But
All right, so we're not going out live at the moment.
Oh no, it's not live. You thought it was, did you?
Oh yeah, I just assumed it was a live stream.
No. I record them and it'll go out in a couple of days, and I usually have to like edit. Yeah, so there's no problem there. So when you're so you would, and you don't like to consider yourself a mystic, or do you?
I don't call myself that because this goes back to what we were discussing earlier about this whole the whole idea of recognizing the egoic identity, what it is, and transcending it through that recognition. And one of the most common traps for those on what you might call the spiritual path is that they will begin to conceive of themselves either as someone on a spiritual journey or some great spiritual teacher or something of that nature. But of course, those things are just another form of egoic identity. And so they have essentially been tricked by the mind into another form of egoic identity. But because that form of egoic identity has better garb, I guess, because it seems more appealing, they don't recognize it for what it is. So I don't refer to myself at all. If I have to give the real mystic answer, if someone asks me, well, who are you? I just say I'm nothing and no one. I just defer to silence.
Like Odysseus when he was being quizzed by Polyphemus. I'm nobody from nowhere. No, that's good. So in your own sense of yourself then, do you feel like you've peeled away the layers so thoroughly that you're kind of a raw and innocent cosmic egg just floating around, untouchable and untouched? Or have you assumed an ego in the moment, especially when you're helping people? Do you like put on a suit and pretend you're a human?
Yeah, as far it is a bit tongue-in-cheek because, as I've said before, I use the example, if I go down to my local shop and the woman behind the counter says, "Hello, David," I don't give some bizarre answer. I just say, "Hello." The egoic identity is still there, and it's necessary because it tells you who and what you are in the world. It's just not the sum total of what you are. You are fundamentally the consciousness that preceded that egoic identity. So, of course, when you interact with other souls in your day-to-day life, you have to refer to that egoic identity, unless you're going to give an exposition on mysticism to everyone you encounter. So, yeah.
So if animals are living in a kind of, I don't want to say perfect, but I'll say, for the sake of this, perfected egoic early state. So then it would be the same for humans in a way, to live as close to that as possible, not necessarily in like brutality, but to get closer to animal innocence. Am I right? Would you say that?
I don't know if I'd go that far because there is a distinction. That there's a reason that we were born into mortal form. There's different degrees of consciousness, and I'm not saying, when I refer to animals, I'm just using them as an example of a creature that never develops the cognitive capacity to contemplate itself and therefore never loses that innocence. But that's not to say that we in human form are identical to animals in every way. I wouldn't go that far.
No, I didn't mean that exactly, but I might have trouble trying to frame my question there. Yeah, I know humans are different from animals, but to say if humans did achieve, I wouldn't believe there was an ideal state they could just slip into and we could all just live and think in an ideal state all the time. And not that we're not in an ideal state, or that it's not obviously necessary. If the cosmos deems it necessary that we must adopt these egos from time to time to change and do certain things, then it must be part of its plan. No, I have that kind of view of.
Absolutely. There is no accident, and this is one reason that those who express mystic thought are never evangelical, because they recognize that there is a time for souls to be bound in ego. There are most souls in this world, they love being bound in their ego. They love the role they have in the world. But just as there's a time for everyone to be bound in that egoic identity and to believe themselves to be the human being exclusively, there is also a time for the soul to come out of that, to awaken from that. And the way the Supreme, the Absolute, the Most High has arranged it is that only a few in any generation will do that. And the reason is that you can't have a functional society, you can't have functional civilization if everyone is going to renounce worldly concerns for spiritual concerns. And so there is a great balance here that mystics have always recognized, and that's why they would never try to force everyone else to their place.
So you believe there's in every generation, a certain amount picking up, aren't we? Oh, we're having some connection problems. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now, yeah.
Okay. I was going to say, so in every generation, you think there's a few souls that are chosen or become this, as you said, somewhat angelic or closer to God in their intention. You
Absolutely,
would think
yes.
and they're like meant to be natural leaders, or
no.
No.
I don't know. Mystics just renounce the world. They don't. For mystics renounce the world, and they make themselves available to those who are likewise on the same path. That's it. They're not destined to be leaders of men or anything like that.
No, so there's no like the philosopher king. There's no mystic king. It sounds like it'd be glorious.
No.
Okay, so but like and so in your personal conception, so you believe? Did you say you believe you have an idea of reincarnation, or is it you have
Yes,
more Christian?
I would accept reincarnation. Yeah.
Okay, and more or less along the Hindu lines.
Yes, it's interesting. There's a mystic from the mid 20th century that I often refer to, and he said something interesting on the subject of reincarnation. Now, this mystic was Ramana Maharshi from the Hindu tradition. I love Ramana Maharshi. He's my favorite modern mystic that is no longer in mortal form. But there is one point I disagree with him on. He often said controversial things, and I agree with all of those controversial things except for this one. He said that because the egoic identity was ultimately illusory, which is true, he said that there could be no reincarnation because ultimately there's nothing to be reborn. Now, I understand that perspective because I've said it earlier that we are consciousness. We are not the egoic identity we take ourselves to be. And so it makes sense for Ramana to say, therefore, that since we are not these egoic identities, there is nothing to be reborn. But my point would be that once consciousness is invested in that ego, if they fail to transcend that, then they will need to be reborn until they do. So consciousness in that way is bound by its own understandings of itself. And that's where a difference would lie. That's why I do maintain a belief in reincarnation. But again, that is something very abstract and not something I would immediately bring up to someone, because that would just be a belief that they either accept or reject.
Well, his view is very anti-material or anti-reality. It sounds quite extreme. But I guess I can see, like conceptually speaking, if you are so detached and you have a realization that your real self is something so utterly apart from reality, then the reality is inconsequential. But I would have a hard time with that too. I do think reality is important. I think it's definitely the visible miracle all around us, like happening by second, and there's no denying the reality of it, whatever our consciousness truly is. Or
I think it's important to look at a consensus. When you're looking at the history of mystic thought from around the world, historically, mystics, when they gave their message, like Yeshua, for example, in the Gospels, there was a definite urgency to his message. Mystics gave warnings of the consequence of not recognizing, the way I would put it, not recognizing their true nature. Now, if things were as Ramana made out in that instance, then there would simply be no need for such an urgency. I believe there is a need for such an urgency for those who are concerned with it.
Okay, can you hear me now? We definitely have some connections. You broke up at the end there, and then sometimes, every now and again, this happens. It's happened a couple times, and then it breaks up for me, so I can't hear it. And then when I look back at the video, it's actually me that's like broken up on the. So
yeah, you just
I missed
it there for a moment.
Can you just repeat the last 30 seconds or not less? I missed it.
I can't remember what I said now.
No, it doesn't matter. Okay, it doesn't matter. Yeah, so that's interesting. I didn't know that much about the Hinduism until I had a good long talk with a Hindu friend of mine who I met on Twitter, and I sort of interviewed him, and I began to understand it a bit more. and how very fascinating ancient belief. But I didn't know certain things about it. Like they also have the concept of hell and stuff. It's just that it's not a forever place. It's just like, well, I mean, most people did have some sort of word for it. I mean, the word originally comes from, is it from the Nordic word? I don't know where it comes from originally. But.
Yeah, I believe it's from the Nordic hell, but it's spelled Hel, just one L.
Yeah, she was a goddess with like half her face was all like a horror movie. It was burnt or something, wasn't it? Or something like that.
I don't know.
I've seen depictions and she looks pretty frightening. But I didn't realize that they had that too. Like there was also a concept of hell for the true sinner. But he also was telling me that this is the clincher of the whole wanting to escape the cycle of rebirth. How did he put it now? It was like the last thing you should have is sort of a vanity or an idea of yourself of desiring or wanting things overly out of a vanity or a sense of ego. So he said in that sense it was actually a mistaken path to really want to leave the cycle because that was showing like a kind of egoism of its own as well.
Exactly. I would completely agree with that. And that goes back to what I said earlier about instead of conceiving of yourself in some way, no matter how spiritual, just surrender it all to God, as it were. Just surrender it all. Surrender your motivations, surrender your attachments, just surrender everything and simply be. That's ultimately the way.
Right. Just simply be. It sounds so
simple.
simple.
And Hinduism, I don't even pretend to know Hinduism in and out because I don't think it's possible. Hinduism, it can't, even though it's considered a religion, it's more like a category of religions because it's so enormously complicated. And what is true of one Hindu sect is not necessarily going to be true of another Hindu sect, but it's certainly a very venerable and worthy tradition. And if I had the time it would take to study it in depth, so I knew it inside out, then I certainly would.
Yeah. And a lot of them are quite excited by these sort of quasi resurgence of paganism in Europe, at least online. I don't think it's anywhere else except in Iceland. But they seem to think they encourage that. They recognize it as similar to theirs. But yeah, when I tried to get down to the brass tacks of it with them, I was like, oh my God, this is far more vast than I mean, you could spend the rest of your life studying it and still not really understand
exactly
all the ins and outs of it and the story and everything.
And this is why spirituality can't be an intellectual project, even though most souls mistake it as such.
Right.
Spirituality is not an intellectual project. It's a direct experience of spirit. It's a direct experience of consciousness, and that's all it is. Reading sacred texts, it may help you. Thinking things through may help you, and listening to spiritual teachers may help you. They may be necessary steps along the way, but until you start turning inside yourself, as it were, to have that direct experience of the consciousness that you are, then you haven't even begun to engage in spirituality.
Right. So for you, if I'm not mistaken, it happened originally with an event where you felt you were like sitting around and you suddenly had a feeling like you were like God was with you or affecting you. Is that right?
Yeah, I was working in this particular office, and I went in one morning, and I was always the first in, and so it was just me and two other souls in this office. Although in this particular room,
you would at least be alone in the woods or something. We're at work of all places. Go on.
Yeah, so I put the kettle on. I sat down in front of the PC, and I was considering, because I like to think about spiritual things, and I was on that particular morning. I was thinking about the power of prayer. And then at once, I was just overwhelmed with this inexpressible feeling of peace and joy, and the world around me suddenly felt permeated with what I knew to be the essence of God. And so when I moved my arms around, I was moving it through the essence of God, and I knew that it wasn't that God had just appeared there all of a sudden. It's that I had suddenly become aware of the fact that God was always there. It's just that we aren't normally aware of it. And so that was the experience that essentially turned my life around and led me to where I am now.
So were your coworkers looking at you and you were like,
oh no, it was just me. It was just me in the office at that particular time, but I was certainly in a good mood for the rest of the week.
How long did it last? Can I ask?
The experience at its height, feeling God permeate the world around me, that lasted only about 5 minutes, but the peace and the joy, that lasted about a week.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
But what type of person were you before this? Were you much different?
I was always someone who had an interest in the big questions in life, but that experience ultimately awoke me to the fact that it's not about absorbing endless amounts of information, because I used to be someone who just studied, as much. I just read as much as I could get my hands on. I studied every spiritual tradition there was. I was just endlessly consuming information. And although I didn't recognize it at the time, what I was subconsciously hoping for was to stumble upon some revelation in a book somewhere that just made sense of everything. And
Right.
that experience eventually led me to see that intellectual information can't get you to that place. Only a direct experience of the spiritual can bring you that gnosis, as it were. And so, yes, after a few years of going astray immediately after that experience, where I mistook the nature of the experience, I eventually returned and realized what was important. And it's a long story, but that's how I ended up where I am today.
Right. Can I ask what age were you too?
I was 27 at that point.
Right. So quite young. And you were able to keep working through the day, and
Oh yes, I was able to keep working.
it
In
wasn't
fact,
like
I think that was the best day of work I ever put in, because everything just felt so alive. Everything had a purpose. Everything had a reason all of a sudden, in a way that's very hard to express.
Well, I mean, I've had that feeling, but I know I've done it unnaturally, as it were, on psychedelics. And I know you don't promote the use of psychedelics, but I've had that. I mean, most people who take them can have that kind of euphoric feeling. I also had the opposite, the hell-like introspective torment moments on it as well, which was, it's anything, as they say, anything doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So probably better for it in many ways, as long as it doesn't literally kill you. It's hard to recommend drugs to people. It's a fine line to walk, and I do sort of, in a way, recommend it, but I won't get into it because I know. But
Yeah, my
what would
view.
you? Sorry,
Sorry, and my view is quite simply that any people, souls can do what they want with their own mortal form, and if people want to do hallucinogens, that's their business. I don't see any problem with it at all. Nor do I deny the legitimacy of their experiences, because I know
Oh,
that people can have life-changing experiences having done those things. My argument is simply that it would surely be preferable if your spirituality was more organic, if it wasn't reliant on some kind of substance, if it was something that you can access anytime, which in truth you can, because you are consciousness.
yeah. I do think it's good in sort of waking you up to the ongoing miracle, the moment by moment miracle of reality. Just when you do that, and you stare at your hand or a flower or a pebble or something for an hour, and you're amazed by it, and it does stick with you afterwards, where you can be like, yeah, it's more amazing than because you get used to life as you go through it, or you get caught up in. It's one of those things that breaks you out of that kind of routine of fake personality, fake ego too. I think it does help with that as well. I believe it's more like people that are more on the straight and narrow, let's say, that easily slip into they'll change their personality for a job, and it'll affect them in the entire process of their life. I think in some ways, the kind of adaptability where everybody, maybe we all have to do that sometimes to a certain degree, but it's best to not take it seriously and to kind of laugh at it. I think is the best way
Exactly.
to deal with it.
Yeah, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about, from this place of consciousness, having a kind of tongue-in-cheek approach to life, where you know that for as long as you live in mortal form, you've got to play the human game, as it were. So
Yeah.
because others understand me as David McMurdo, I've got to play that game. But from
Right.
that place of consciousness, you know not to take it too seriously. Whereas when you're fully invested in that game, the game is all there is. It's akin to an actor going on stage and forgetting that they're playing a role,
Right.
and someone playing Macbeth and believing that they've actually just murdered King Duncan, for example. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. So, and say, like, in this time now, when so many people are obviously suffering psychologically, it seems, what do you have any kind of, like, I don't broad advice, I guess, or is there anything you'd say to them on a mass scale that you could say, not being one to one, or?
most people, most souls aren't interested, because the dark secret is, the dark truth is that most souls enjoy their suffering on some degree. It's part of their egoic identity, and it's how they identify themselves. You see this very clearly with the kind of victimhood culture that is very prevalent in the modern day. See, to be a victim traditionally is a negative thing, but it's very clear that in many cases, this victimhood is what gives them several legs up in certain social circumstances. And it becomes such a strong part of the way they understand themselves that even though to be a victim is to suffer to some degree, they would not willingly renounce that. So I'm under no illusions that when I say these things, few are going to listen. But yes, the simple answer to all these things is to let it all go. Just let go of most importantly, let go of your own idea of who you are.
Yeah, I like that answer. It's more like stop whining, or I'll give you something to whine about. Because it is like self-pity. It's either self-pity or showing off in some ways. But I mean, that's...
Well, I think you've frozen again from my perspective.
And all this, but it's like, if they would just... I know it's supposed to be a chemical thing and they can't control it and these kind of things, but what do you think about that? I don't know. Like, you always hear that kind of story.
You froze up for a moment there, so I didn't hear a bit of what you said.
So what do you say about people that say that depression and that is like a chemical thing in their brain and nothing to do with how they behave or how they have no control of it, let's say?
Well, I'm very careful not to speak with authority on areas that I know nothing about. I don't know anything about the brain and the chemicals in the brain, but what I do know is that since you are not the physical body and since you are not even your psychology, since you transcend both of those things, it's possible to transcend those kind of those things that might cripple your mortal form. Since that is not the sum total of what you are, you don't need to be crippled by those things.
Right.
Like, no one in my real life, no one online has seen me angry, has seen me depressed. I am always the same for this exact reason, is that I recognize myself as the consciousness that I am, the consciousness that transcends the mortal form and that transcends the psychology. So I can have all kinds of emotions arising within me. My psychology can be going all over the place, and that's okay because I'm the one watching it all. I'm not the one right there in the center of this maelstrom.
Well, I always think I was well conditioned by a psychedelic experience. I've talked about it before, where I took way too much. Me and a friend, I was at a party at my house, and I completely lost it. And I did not know what I was doing at all. I ended up getting arrested and thrown in the drunk tank, we call it in Canada, where you get thrown in the jail overnight because you're out of control. But I woke up. I sort of woke up in the jail, and I was still hallucinating to the point that like the walls were moving and such, but I had no memory of how I got there. So and this is a memory I have, like, still, like, I can call on it as a real life memory of thinking, okay, I must have gone to hell. I must have died and gone to hell because, and I honestly thought that for the rest of the night. I sat there and I thought, I'm never, ever getting out of here. So
wow, that must have been a terrifying experience.
Well, it was depressing. But then they opened the doors in the morning. I was like, hey, and I was like the happiest guy. I don't know what they thought when they let me out. I was the happiest. And they opened the doors, it was just like I was just overjoyed. So, but that was because that part of that trip was when I was coming down, and in reality, it's like I feel like nothing can actually happen in reality that could come near that. So it's one of those Nietzschean didn't kill me deals where, I don't know, I think it strengthened me psychologically, personally. That's just my own personal story. So, that plays into the thing where it's like, if you avoid self-pity and looking for attention through your misery, as you say, if misery is like a bright, shiny dress they can put on, it's like the more serious trauma you go, not to say I was anything like a World War I veteran or any veteran or anything like that too, though that seems to kind of break them psychologically too. I guess that's another issue. But some certain levels of trauma psychologically can cure you of depression over simple, silly things like losing a job or your girlfriend leaves or something like that. Like that's my point there. So yeah, what would you say about people that get, just since I brought it up through my rambling, people that get depressed through past trauma? I guess maybe you wouldn't know, again, it's out of your realm, but through war.
This is actually, you mentioned earlier the opposition that I would receive from religionists, and that's certainly true. But a more modern trend I'm finding increasingly is opposition from what you might call a psychological perspective. And these particular souls who are not qualified themselves in psychology, but they'll use very emotive examples of trauma to say, well, how can you be so dismissive of this or that? Well, the first thing to point out is that different souls cope with trauma differently. That
Right.
that trauma which sends one soul down a path of destruction for the rest of their lives will be nothing to another soul who in some way manages to overcome it. And ultimately, when someone undergoes trauma, the choice is this: does that trauma define you for the rest of your mortal life? Is that going to shade the rest of your mortal life, or is it not? And I'm sorry, but there are many souls I've noticed, and let's face it, there's a massive industry dependent upon souls dwelling upon this trauma and constantly revisiting it, because they don't get a paycheck unless they constantly revisit it. And again, they become victims almost to their own psychology, because this trauma becomes central to how they understand themselves, and therefore not only is it something that they can't seem to let go of, it becomes something that they don't want to let go of. And there are many, again, professionals out there who wouldn't want them to let go of them because their paycheck depends upon it. So
Right.
this is
Yeah.
another advantage of my rather laid-back disposition, is that
Yeah.
I'm not asking anyone. I don't care if no one accepts what I say. I'm just here to speak to those who are willing to listen. So I don't care to sit down and argue with. If you want to let some trauma define who and what you are for the rest of your mortal life, you go ahead. That's your business. I'm just saying there's an alternative.
Yeah, it's sort of like they use and wear that trauma like a if the culture around them is going to make it a thing where, show me your trauma so I can weep over you and use that to signal my compassion. Let's say, that's sort of just they're only going to encourage the more negative results of that trauma, as opposed to, as you say, you don't have to make it like a total triviality, but just, I would say, sum it up with everything else in life as a list of potential highs and lows of like fun and brutality, and like, you can be lucky or unlucky with it, but either way, I mean, there's people that have incredibly short brutish lives and still don't make it, so far as to go through a war to begin with, let alone they used to say of the old soldiers from the old war that they simply wouldn't talk about it, and they sort of they just sort of went on with their lives. They didn't gather and like have big open weeping sessions and carry on about it,
And you see this around the world. You don't see this kind of Western, how would you put it, Western glamorization of trauma and suffering in, for example, third world countries, where people every single day are just trying to get fresh water, are trying to make sure their families are fed. Somehow they're not crippled, even though from a human perspective, they have every reason to be crippled with all kinds of trauma. Somehow they're not. Somehow they are able to persist and survive. And I would suggest it's because there's an element in the Western world that has fetishized this form of suffering.
I think I can say what it is to a certain degree, but I almost dare not. In fact, okay, I'll say it, but I may cut this out because it may stray into a political area that I don't wish to get into. But I'd like to know your opinion. I'd like to know your opinion. Is that and this only dawned on me like recently enough, exactly the limits of this, but it's to do with the Western world. Like, I know, like my wife was telling me recently, or she was saying in her work, let's say, she's talking with her work friends, and one of them had some kind of problem. Was it? I don't remember what it was. Something like, I think her child had disability or something. And because of this, when they were all together and they talked with her, she had a certain status above the rest of them because of this problem. It was a serious like social status thing. And I never heard of this. Like, I found it inconceivable. And she was explaining this to me. And this is my theory is based on pure anecdotal, experience. But I wouldn't doubt if it was something to do with that. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. You see this all the time. Someone undergoes a trauma and suddenly they are perceived as someone who can speak with authority on anything. It does.
Yeah, it's come about through this feminization of the culture, so that we're all existing now in kind of feminine social hierarchy. Maybe.
Yes, I would agree with that. Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. So what do you? I mean, that's getting dangerous. I could get in that. I don't know. I'd say it's very much what has happened. So that, if that's true, then that plays into this whole thing of people fetishizing their trauma and just getting worse with it. I mean, on top of other issues, it's a whole other avenue of despair and, crap
Oh yes, it's a big psychological mess out there, and I'm just uh, grateful to God to be able to just observe it.
That's
Just see it all play
yeah.
out.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's hard to even comment on it, or so. Yeah, you can't even. So you couldn't give that advice to somebody and play into these factors and say the real truth of what you felt was going on, if it even though it might help them. It's like I heard it recently too. Some teenager decided to kill himself. This is actually before the COVID. It was a while ago now, but he decided to do it at the public park from a tree. It was such an obvious, like, show off way to do it. It's, you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't just like, oh, I definitely want to die, I'm done. It was more like, look at me, I've killed myself. And it just occurred to me the showiness of it, just the weird.
Yeah, well, there's that cliche teenage thing, "Oh, everyone would be so sad if I killed myself." You do see that kind of mentality a lot.
Yeah, but then to actually go through with it in this, and for these showy, silly reasons, I mean,
Yeah.
it's awful. But yeah, so we got a bit dark there, I guess, but whatever.